Jamir Owens stood at the entrance of Summit Solutions Group, the gleaming corporate tower looming overhead. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Today marked the start of his internship, an opportunity he had worked tirelessly to secure. But the weight of unspoken challenges hung over him. Being a young black man in a predominantly white corporate environment meant he'd have to prove himself even harder. As the elevator ascended to the third floor, Jamir reminded himself why he was here. No one in the company knew his secret. He was the son of Michael Owens, the CEO. Jamir had insisted on keeping his identity hidden to earn his place without the shadow of his father's influence. When the elevator doors opened, the bustling office greeted him. At its center stood Susan Byers, a tall, imposing woman with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Her gaze sharpened as it landed on Jamir. Susan approached him with an air of superiority. "Jamir Owens," she said with a thin smile. "I see we've started hiring for diversity." Jamir blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "Oh, come on," Susan continued, her tone dripping with mockery. "Let's not pretend. You're here because the company needed to fill a quota, right?" Jamir kept his face neutral, despite the insult. "I'm here because I earned this position?" Susan let out a laugh that was anything but friendly. "Of course, that's what they all say." She pivoted sharply. "Follow me. I'll show you where you'll be working." As they weaved through the office, Susan offered no real introduction to the team or the workflow. Her brisk pace and clipped explanations left little room for questions. Jamir noticed the subtle glances of other employees as he passed, some curious, others indifferent, and a few quick to avert their eyes. Susan finally stopped at a small, cramped cubicle shoved into a corner, far from the bustling activity of the main office. She gestured toward the desk, the faint smirk never leaving her face. "Here you go. Not the best spot, but it's what we've got for now," she said. "Let's see if you can keep up. The last intern I had didn't last long, but then again," her eyes glinted with something malicious, "they didn't have the advantages you might have." Jamir's jaw tightened, but he gave a polite nod. "I'll do my best." Susan leaned against the cubicle wall, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the subtle power play. "We'll see about that. You'd better be ready to prove yourself. We don't tolerate mediocrity here." Without another word, she walked off, leaving Jamir alone in his small workspace. He sank into the chair, his mind racing. Susan Byers was going to be a problem. That much was clear. Her thinly veiled disdain and blatant dismissal of his abilities were more than just unprofessional. They were personal. Jamir opened his laptop and began setting up, his hands trembling slightly. But as the minutes ticked by, his resolve hardened. He had dealt with people like Susan before, people who saw his success as a threat or an anomaly. He wasn't going to let her get under his skin. From across the office, Michael Owens watched his son from a distance. He had agreed to keep their relationship under wraps, but that didn't mean he wasn't paying attention. He could see the tension in Jamir's shoulders, the way he clenched his jaw as he worked. Michael's expression darkened as he caught sight of Susan, her condescending smirk still visible as she spoke to another manager. For now, Michael remained silent, letting Jamir handle things on his own. But he made a mental note to keep an eye on Susan Byers. She didn't know it yet, but her actions were being watched. Jamir, meanwhile, buried himself in his tasks. He wasn't here to make friends or prove himself to people like Susan. He was here to work, to learn, and to build something meaningful. And no amount of hostility or undermining would stop him from achieving that. The internship had begun, and Jamir Owens was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The first week of Jamir's internship was a baptism by fire. From the moment Susan Byers became his supervisor, she seemed to take a particular interest in making his life as difficult as possible. Her condescension was relentless, her disdain palpable, and her jabs barely disguised. It wasn't long before Jamir realized that Susan wasn't just uninterested in mentoring him, she was actively working to undermine him. Each morning began with Susan's sharp voice barking out orders or thinly veiled criticisms. "Jamir," she called out one day, holding a stack of reports aloft as she approached his desk. "Can you explain what this is supposed to be?" Jamir looked up from his laptop, puzzled. That's the analysis you asked for on the client accounts, he replied calmly, gesturing toward the neatly organized charts and figures he'd spent hours perfecting. Susan slammed the stack onto his desk with a force that made nearby interns glance over. This, she said, pointing to a random section, is sloppy work. Did you even read the instructions? Jamir's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone level. I followed the outline you provided, but if there's an issue, I'll fix it. Susan smirked, leaning over the desk. You'd better. We wouldn't want to waste everyone's time, would we? Her words stung, but Jamir forced himself to nod. I'll get it done. Susan straightened, her sharp blue eyes glinting with satisfaction. See that you do. We don't have room for mistakes. As she walked away, Jamir exhaled slowly, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had faced subtle racism before, but Susan's behavior wasn't subtle. It was overt and unrelenting. She didn't just want to undermine him, she wanted him to fail. Susan's criticisms were constant, but what infuriated Jamir most was her favoritism toward the other interns. She often hovered over the desks of the white interns, offering encouragement and guidance, while leaving Jamir to fend for himself. Great work, Allison, Susan said one afternoon, stopping by another intern's desk. This is exactly the kind of initiative we like to see. Allison smiled brightly, her confidence bolstered by the praise. Jamir, seated a few desks away, couldn't help but notice the difference. When Susan approached him, it was never to offer encouragement. Jamir, she snapped later that day, her tone sharp as she dropped another stack of papers on his desk. I need these corrected by the end of the day, and this time, try to get it right the first time. Yes, ma'am, Jamir replied, his voice calm, but his hands clenched under the desk. The cycle continued day after day. Susan would assign Jamir tasks, criticize his work no matter how meticulous he was, and make snide comments that belittled his efforts. She seemed to relish the opportunity to remind him of his place, though she never explicitly stated what she meant. Not everyone's cut out for this kind of work, she said one afternoon, glancing pointedly at Jamir as she addressed the team. Some people just don't have the natural aptitude. The other interns shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Jamir knew exactly who her comments were aimed at, but he refused to rise to the bait. While Jamir kept his head down and focused on his work, Michael Owens observed everything from a distance. He had agreed to keep their relationship a secret to allow Jamir to prove himself on his own terms. But that didn't mean he wasn't watching closely. Michael's office, with its glass walls overlooking the floor, gave him a clear view of Susan's interactions with Jamir. He noticed the way she loomed over his desk, the sharpness of her tone, and the smirk she exchanged with other managers after speaking with him. Michael's jaw tightened as he watched Susan deliver yet another stack of corrected reports to Jamir's desk, her tone dripping with condescension. This was Jamir's test, and Michael wanted to see how his son would handle it. As the weeks wore on, Jamir's frustration grew, but so did his determination. He refused to let Susan's behavior define his experience. He arrived early each morning, often before the rest of the interns, and stayed late, ensuring that every task he was given was completed with precision. Susan, however, wasn't content to leave him alone. She seemed to delight in finding new ways to test him. One day, she assigned him a report with a vague and contradictory set of instructions, then criticized him for not meeting her unspoken expectations. Jamir, she said, waving the report in the air, this isn't what I asked for. You need to pay closer attention. Jamir bit back the urge to argue. Instead, he calmly asked, could you clarify what changes you'd like me to make? Susan's smirk faltered for a moment before she recovered. Figure it out. That's what you're here for. Jamir watched her walk away, his chest tightening with anger. He had done everything she asked, and yet she found new ways to undermine him at every turn. But instead of letting her win, he used her hostility as fuel. One afternoon, after hours of revising a report Susan had repeatedly criticized, Jamir submitted it to her again. To his surprise, she flipped through the pages and found nothing to complain about. Not bad, she said begrudgingly, her tone lacking its usual venom. Guess you're finally getting the hang of it. It wasn't much, but it was a small victory, one that Jamir savored quietly. He didn't need Susan's approval, but every moment she failed to break him was a triumph. Jamir understood that dealing with Susan wasn't just about surviving the internship. He knew that his father was watching, and he trusted that Susan's behavior would eventually catch up to her. Each evening, as the office emptied and Jamir packed up his things, he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just a job. It was a test of his resilience, his determination, and his ability to rise above the pettiness of people like Susan Byers. Susan thought she had the upper hand, but Jamir knew the truth. She didn't realize who she was dealing with, not yet, and when the moment came, Susan wouldn't know what hit her. The morning of the board meeting, Summit Solutions was buzzing with anticipation. The air was charged with tension as executives and managers prepared their presentations, eager to impress the decision-makers. Susan Byers, however, was positively glowing with confidence. Her sharp blue eyes sparkled, and a smug smile tugged at her lips as she strutted through the office, her heels clicking on the polished floor like a drumbeat of authority. This was her moment, and she knew it. For weeks, she had dropped hints about her prospects for promotion, carefully planting seeds in conversations with her peers. Susan's certainty was evident to anyone who crossed her path that day. Jamir, however, watched her from the relative quiet of his cubicle, a mixture of frustration and anticipation swirling in his chest. He knew that today wasn't just about Susan's career aspirations. It was about the truth finally coming to light. His father, Michael Owens, had hinted that changes were on the horizon, and Jamir couldn't shake the feeling that Susan's reckoning was near. The boardroom was a scene of corporate theater. Executives took turns presenting quarterly updates and strategies, their voices steady and rehearsed. Michael Owens sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but unreadable. Susan, seated near him, leaned forward eagerly, her every gesture calculated to project competence and charm. When her turn came, Susan launched into her presentation with practiced ease. She gestured confidently towards slides detailing her team's achievements, carefully omitting Jamir's contributions, of course. This quarter, Susan concluded, has been a testament to what effective leadership can accomplish. I believe we've set the standard for success moving forward. Michael nodded, his face betraying no emotion. Thank you, Susan. That was insightful. As the meeting continued, Susan's self-satisfaction only grew. She caught Jamir's eye through the glass walls of the boardroom as he worked at his desk. Her smirk was unmistakable. I'm winning. When the meeting ended, Susan emerged with a beaming smile, radiating the energy of someone who believed she had secured her promotion. Michael followed shortly behind, his face as composed as ever. Jamir caught the briefest glance from his father, a silent signal. Moments later, Michael called out, "Jamir, come here for a second." Jamir stood, smoothing his tie as he approached. Susan froze, her smile faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. Michael gestured for them both to join him near the conference room. "Susan," he began, his tone casual, "have you had the chance to work closely with Jamir?" Susan's smile tightened, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh yes," she said, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "Jamir's been around." Michael raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "And how's he doing?" Susan tilted her head, her smirk returning. "Well," she began, "Jamir's been doing okay. I mean, you know how these interns are. It's a steep learning curve for some of them." She cast a sidelong glance at Jamir, her tone light but condescending. "Not everyone's cut out for this kind of work." Jamir felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Really?" Michael asked, his tone measured. "Has he had any specific challenges?" Susan shrugged, clearly relishing the opportunity to shape the narrative. "Oh, nothing major. But you know, some people require a bit more guidance. They're not always as prepared as others when they come in. It takes them a little more time to catch up." Jamir clenched his fist beneath the table, his frustration mounting. He had worked tirelessly since day one, only for Susan to paint him as an incompetent burden. But this time, he wasn't going to let her get away with it. "With all due respect, Ms. Byers," Jamir said, his voice steady but firm, "I've completed every task assigned to me on time and without issue. If there have been problems, they've come from obstacles you've created, not from any lack of preparation on my part." Susan's smile froze, her sharp features tightening. She turned to Jamir, her voice low in warning. Watch yourself, Jamir. You don't want to overstep. Jamir met her gaze without flinching. I'm just stating the facts. The tension in the hallway was palpable. Michael, watching silently, finally spoke, his tone calm but deliberate. Interesting. Susan blinked, caught off guard. What? This whole conversation has been interesting, Michael said, his gaze sharp. We'll discuss this further later, Susan. That'll be all for now. Susan opened her mouth to respond but quickly thought better of it. She gave a stiff nod and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor with less confidence than before. A moment of truth. Michael turned to Jamir, his expression softening. You handled that well, he said quietly. Jamir nodded, though his heart was still racing. Thanks, Dad. Michael placed a hand on Jamir's shoulder. Go home and get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be important. As Jamir left the building that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. For weeks he had endured Susan's bullying in silence, knowing that the moment of reckoning would come. And now he was certain. The truth was finally about to come to light. The next morning, Jamir and Susan were summoned to Michael's office. The tension in the room was palpable as they took their seats. Michael began calmly. Susan, you've worked closely with Jamir. How would you evaluate his performance? Susan hesitated but recovered quickly. He's trying his best, but he's needed more guidance than most. Michael's gaze sharpened. And do you think he has the potential to succeed here? Susan's voice turned condescending. Some people aren't built for this kind of work. Jamir's background doesn't exactly prepare him for a place like this. Jamir had had enough. The only thing holding me back has been you, Ms. Byers. From day one, you've sabotaged me and made it clear you don't think I belong here. Susan bristled. That's ridiculous. Michael cut her off. Susan, stop. There's something you should know. Jamir is my son. The blood drained from Susan's face. Your son? Yes, Michael said coldly. The intern you've belittled, bullied, and sabotaged for weeks. Your behavior has been unacceptable, and your time here is over. Pack your things. Susan tried to protest, but Michael's expression silenced her. Defeated, she left the office, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The weeks following Susan Byers' dramatic departure from Summit Solutions felt like the dawn of a new era for Jamir Owens. The office, once a place of tension and quiet hostility, now buzzed with an energy that Jamir could only describe as lighter. Colleagues who had once avoided making eye contact now greeted him in passing, their smiles genuine. The shift in atmosphere should have been reassuring, yet Jamir couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. He wasn't naive. Reputation in a corporate environment was a fragile thing. The story of Susan's downfall had spread quickly, and though most seemed impressed by how Jamir had handled himself, there were still whispers. Some of his coworkers looked at him with newfound respect, but others glanced at him as though waiting for him to falter. Jamir buried himself in work, determined to ensure there was no reason for doubt. His projects were submitted ahead of schedule, each one meticulously detailed and airtight in execution. Every decision he made was measured, calculated. Yet, despite his outward confidence, the weight of being under a microscope wore on him. The subtle shift. There were moments when Jamir caught himself wondering how deep the change in perception truly ran. While many colleagues were quick to offer encouraging words or small gestures of camaraderie, some interactions still carried an edge of skepticism. One afternoon during a team meeting, Jamir presented a report on a new client acquisition strategy. His ideas were well-reasoned, supported by extensive research and data. As he concluded, the room fell silent for a brief moment before a senior manager, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat. Well, Caldwell began, leaning back in his chair, that's certainly thorough. Jamir's heart skipped a beat. There was a hesitation in Caldwell's tone that felt loaded, as though he were searching for a polite way to undermine the effort. Another voice broke the tension before Caldwell could continue. It's more than thorough, Lisa, one of Jamir's teammates, interjected. It's the most comprehensive analysis we've had on this topic. I think we'd be smart to move forward with it. The room shifted again, this time in Jamir's favor. Caldwell nodded reluctantly, his critique abandoned, and several others murmured their agreement. Jamir thanked Lisa with a subtle nod, but the encounter stayed with him. He realized that while he had earned the respect of many, there were still those waiting for him to make a misstep. Quiet observations. Michael Owens watched all of this unfold from a distance. His son's growing confidence and ability to navigate corporate dynamics filled him with pride. But Michael also knew the burden Jamir carried. Change didn't happen overnight, and while Susan's departure had opened a door, it was up to Jamir to keep pushing forward. One evening, Michael called Jamir into his office. The glow of the city skyline behind him cast long shadows across the room. "How are you holding up?" Michael asked, leaning back in his chair. Jamir hesitated. "I'm managing," he replied honestly. Michael nodded knowingly. "You've proven yourself, but I know that doesn't mean the pressure has gone away." "It won't." "Not immediately." Jamir looked down at his hands, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "But," Michael continued, his tone steady, "the way you've handled yourself so far shows me that you're not just surviving here, you're thriving. Don't let the doubts of others dictate your path." Jamir nodded, his resolve hardening. "I won't." The road ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Jamir's workload increased. Michael assigned him to more prominent projects, and his responsibilities grew. Jamir welcomed the challenge, knowing that each success would further cement his place at Summit Solutions. But even as he excelled, the tension remained. There were still whispers, still occasional glances that reminded him of the doubts some harbored. It wasn't enough to prove himself once. He had to do it again and again. And Jamir was ready. The path ahead was steep, but he had climbed steeper hills before. Each challenge only served to sharpen his skills, strengthen his resolve, and prepare him for what lay ahead. The future was his to claim, and Jamir was determined to claim it on his own terms. As Jamir continued to navigate his newfound role and the shifting dynamics within Summit Solutions, he felt the dual pressures of expectation and scrutiny growing heavier by the day. The high-profile projects he had been entrusted with were not just opportunities, they were tests. Every success seemed to carry the unspoken question. Was this earned, or was this because of his father? Even as he excelled, doubt lingered in the air, subtle but ever present. Jamir could feel it in the way some of his colleagues hesitated before offering praise, as though unsure whether to fully accept his abilities. He caught glimpses of it in their eyes during meetings, in the brief pauses before they responded to his ideas. It was a shadow that followed him, quiet but persistent. A quiet warning. One afternoon, Michael Owens called Jamir into his office. The usually vibrant energy of the office floor seemed muted as Jamir walked through it, his thoughts swirling. Michael's office, perched on the top floor, offered a panoramic view of the city, the skyscrapers standing tall against a backdrop of rolling clouds. Michael leaned against his desk, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. Jamir sat down, exhaling slowly. "It's going," he replied. "The projects are on track. The team seems supportive, for the most part, but—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "But what?" Michael pressed gently. Jamir's gaze dropped to his hands. "There are still moments where I feel like people are waiting for me to fail. Like they're looking for proof that I don't deserve to be here." Michael nodded, his face unreadable. "You're not wrong. Change doesn't happen overnight, Jamir. You've already proven more than enough, but not everyone sees it that way yet. Some people, they're slow to let go of their biases. That's their problem, not yours." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Then Michael added, his tone firm but fatherly. "Remember, perception doesn't define reality. Your work speaks louder than their whispers ever could. Keep doing what you're doing." Jamir nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. "I will." A meeting of tensions. Later that week, Jamir found himself in a meeting with senior managers, a group that included some of the most seasoned and influential voices at Summit Solutions. The topic was a pivotal client acquisition, one that could bring millions in revenue and elevate the company's standing in the industry. Jamir had prepared meticulously, arriving early to arrange his materials and rehearse his points. But as the room filled, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Some of the managers offered polite nods, but others barely acknowledged him. When it was Jamir's turn to speak, he stood, projecting confidence despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. As he outlined his strategy, he noted the subtle body language around the table, the way some leaned forward, intrigued, while others exchanged skeptical glances. One manager, Caldwell, interrupted midway through. "Interesting approach," he said, his tone betraying just a hint of condescension. "But don't you think it's a bit ambitious for a client like this?" Jamir paused, his mind racing. Was Caldwell challenging his ideas, or was this another veiled attempt to undermine him? He steadied himself, meeting Caldwell's gaze directly. "With respect," Jamir said, keeping his voice measured, "the research supports this approach. If we aim lower, we risk underserving the client's potential and leaving opportunities on the table. I believe Summit's reputation is built on taking bold but calculated risks and delivering." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Caldwell leaned back, his expression unreadable, but several other managers nodded subtly in agreement. As the meeting continued, Jamir felt the tension ease slightly, though he knew the scrutiny was far from over. The aftermath. After the meeting, Lisa caught up with Jamir in the hallway. "That was impressive," she said, a note of admiration in her voice. "Thanks," Jamir replied, his tone more subdued than he intended. Lisa tilted her head, studying him. "You don't sound convinced." Jamir hesitated, then shrugged. It feels like no matter how well I do, there's always someone ready to doubt it." Lisa offered a small, reassuring smile. "There will always be doubters, but trust me, the people who matter see what you're doing, and they respect it. Don't let the others get in your head." Her words were comforting, but the weight on Jamir's shoulders didn't lessen. He knew that earning respect was a slow process, and he wasn't sure how long he could keep carrying the burden of proving himself. As he returned to his desk, he couldn't help but glance at the skyline outside the window. The city seemed so vast, so full of possibilities, and yet the shadow of doubt loomed just as large. Jamir took a deep breath, centering himself. If the road ahead was steep, then so be it. He would climb it one step at a time.